Chairman Lentil, Assemblywoman Markey, Assemblyman Graff. I am about to tell you something I haven't even told my wife. First time I heard that line was from a grown man I'd known since second grade. I could still remember him in his Little League uniform. We both ended up going to the Horace Mann School, and he shared his secret with me in the context of an article I wrote about sexual abuse at Horace Mann for the New York Times. He was 48 when he finally told me. It was not the last time I was to hear those words. I'm neither a sexual abuse victim nor an expert on the subject. I'm just a guy who many people have entrusted with their most personal experiences. I'm also keenly aware of all the stories I'll never hear. The first time I heard about abuse at Horace Mann firsthand, I had gone camping with several friends. When one of us were around a campfire one night, and my friend told us that he'd been raped by the popular football coach, Mark Wright. We were 27 when he finally spoke. We left the woods, and I remained silent about it for 20 years. I could blame it on being busy or starting a family or a career or the natural drift that friendships take. But the truth is I didn't feel like it was my story to tell. So I locked the story away in a mental filing cabinet. Watching the Sandusky tragedy unfold shook that mental file loose. Remaining silent was no longer an option. For 20 years I've lived with these stories, and I'm not even a victim. As I've come to learn, victims frequently hold their silence for decades or lifetimes. And if they do speak of what happened to them, that first time that they break their silence is more terrifying than anything I can imagine. The men and women who spoke broke a decades-long silence among the entire Horace Mann community. Dozens of sexual abuse victims have poured forth. They've identified 18 predators at Horace Mann alone. One byproduct of sexual abuse is isolation. Another Mark Wright victim wrote me. He wrote me an email in the wake of the article. It's a guy I played baseball and football with. And he wrote, and I thought I was Mark Wright's only little buddy. He's 47. The shame and isolation is as real as it is rampant. A few months back at my own home, another dam broke. A non-Horace Mann friend of mine, he was in my house having dinner, and another otherwise unremarkable dinner, until I described the shock at the statistics that 1 out of 6 kids are abused by the time they're 18. He simply said, I can believe it, and then proceeded to tell me that he'd been abused when he was 5 years old by a neighbor. I hugged him, our wives hugged, and I asked who else knew. He said, just my wife, my therapist, and now you guys. He's 45. These men and women I speak of are not emotionally shut down people. They're highly articulate, wildly successful, deeply sensitive, fully functioning citizens. And still the shame is too great for them to speak about what happened to them so many years ago. I've received thousands of emails from all around the world. Consider one man who attended the Hackley School up in New York, another New York State private school. He wrote, it's about time that I stopped interacting with the school like a 15-year-old student. He's in his 60s. Silence is a part of the perpetrator's game. We know this now. It's their intent. It guides how they choose their victims, the way they groom them, separate them from the pack. Let's keep this our little secret. It's part of the seduction. The silence then moves outwards in concentric circles, from keeping the secret from parents and siblings to friends. Silence moves out to administrators who are often protecting the brand of the school, not to mention their own jobs, and so on. So the silence becomes a habit. And powerlessness metastasizes and it becomes the norm. Think of my friend who told me in my own living room, I can believe it. He has known since he was 5 years old that terrible things happened to him, of which no one spoke, of which he was not supposed to speak. As I said, more than 30 Horace Mann victims have come forward identifying over 18 predators. These survivors have labored in silence for decades under the weight of shame ever since. We know, sadly, they're not alone. I personally know of about a dozen victims who have not come forward yet. Maybe they never will. While their reasons are as unique and individual as they are, over the past year they've all had to confront one common terrible fact. The institution which failed them decades ago has perpetuated the violence they experienced as children by maintaining their silence at an institutional level and by refusing to acknowledge the harm, much less apologize for them even today. Horace Mann, led today by Headmaster Tom Kelly and Chairman of the Board Steve Friedman, has been able to do this because of the statute of limitations. There are currently 9 members of the Board of Trustees that were on the board in 1993 when a student by the name of Ben Balter wrote a letter laying out the abuse that he suffered at the hands of Johannes Samari, the music teacher. The Horace Mann Board of Trustees perceives no institutional incentive to talk, and they have savvy lawyers telling them to wait out the clock. And guess what? Steve Friedman, the chairman of the board, he went on record the other night that he's personally against the Markey bill. Sure he is. Makes sense from his perspective. He thinks the status quo is just fine. But the statute of limitations mirrors the institutional indifference felt by the victims who have shared their experiences. And this institutional indifference triggers more trauma in the present. There's not much we can do about that, but we can do something about the statute of limitations. And just as I've been attacked for writing about these tragic events, so too are victims who speak up. Too often those who defend institutions for whatever reasons, misplaced loyalty, fear, investment in their child's expensive educations, they'll tell you that the victims are speaking out to take down the school, in quotes. Whether this is at Horace Mann, the Boy Scouts, the Catholic Church, Poly Prep, institutions frequently move into self-preservation mode. But their frequent claim that the institution is being attacked, that they're the victim, it's nothing but a cheap parlor trick. The truth is simple. They're choosing a path of cowardice, and their principal weapon in that cowardice is the statute of limitations. Earlier I mentioned the statistic that 1 in 6 children are sexually abused by the time they're 18. Whether we agree on this number or another one, 1 in 8, 1 in 10, 1 in 100 is too many. The simple fact is clear. This is a plague we must address. Today there's some kid in Jackson Heights, in Canarsie, up in Kingsbridge, Bayshore, Long Island, and yes, even Park Avenue, begging for us to remove the statute of limitations. But it's not just the children. There are millions of adult men and women affected by this plague watching us in this room today, waiting for us to take action and take away the chief weapon that institutions use to evade justice. And if we fail to act, we'll be saying to them yet again that we as a society choose silence over our responsibility to help. I sit before you today one man who, although never sexually abused, nevertheless kept silent about it for 20 years. Now I'd like you to picture sitting beside me my 4 friends from the campfire, and behind them 32 Horace Mann victims, and the dozens more who will never speak. I want you to add to that growing number the people from Poly Prep, Yeshiva, the Catholic Church, and so on. Let's leave New York City for a minute. Think of all the silent men and women all over the state of New York, Penfield, Buffalo, Andes, East Hampton. We could fill stadiums. Rather than the roar of a crowd, I want you to imagine silence. And then stop and look at one face in that stadium. It could be a man in his 40s or a woman in his 50s, and know that that's your neighbor. That could be your spouse. That could be the guy that delivers the mail. It could be your child or your child's friend. Silent victims are everywhere, whether we realize it or not. Harvey Milk famously said about the gay rights movement that that revolution would happen one lonely kid at a time. I believe that this revolution will happen one lonely adult at a time. And let's empower these adults to find their voice at home, in their schools, in their church or synagogues. But more importantly, let's empower them to seek justice. And let's banish the sentence. I'm about to tell you something I haven't even told my wife once and for all. I thank you for the honor of allowing me to address this body as you pursue justice for these silent millions.